In a communist society, it's he who wins gets the most toys. And so it's always a battle. And it's a battle between the different communists. And ultimately, the very worst, the most brutal ones, the most backstabbing, the most mass murdering ones are the ones that rise to the top.
Hello, I'm Bill Johnson. Welcome to our podcast, Finally a Decent Podcast. This is about the eighth or ninth podcast that we've done up to this point. And so we're kind of still newbies on the block, but we're learning an awful lot. And one of the things that we can say is we've had some fantastic guests. You can find those guests at the various applications that are common to most of us. My guest today is a dear friend, Jim Simpson. He's an investigative reporter. He's a speaker. He's worked in the federal government, so he's got that perspective as well. He's known as a bold warrior, available by way of the Holy Spirit and God to speak truth into darkness. And so this is going to be an interview that I did in recent days, where I asked Jim permission to go a bit deeper into not only his work itself, but into his formative years that helped to create and mold him into the individual that he is today, the spiritual warfare individual that has made a difference on many different levels. So welcome, my friend, Jim Simpson.
Hey, Bill. Great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Jim, I'd like to just, as I stated, I'd like to be able to get into a little bit of your background. I found that very fascinating. After we got to meet each other, of course, we both let down our hair a little bit. But you lost your dad at an early age. You came out of Connecticut, I believe, right?
I grew up in Connecticut, small town, about 50 miles from New York City, southwestern Connecticut, right on the Long Island Sound. Uh, you know, very pretty little middle class town, and my dad was a uh, salesman for Yale and Town Lock Company, and he went to a meeting in Georgia, and on the way back, the Eastern Airlines flight crashed on landing in bad weather, and the plane broke up, and the half that he was in blew up, and it killed him, of course. And I was 10 years old at the time, and I can honestly say, it's the best thing that's ever happened to me in my life. Although there have been similar experiences since, and we've all gone through loss. We all know what it feels like. When you're a kid, it's especially impactful. I felt as though God had stolen from me the one person I loved and admired more than anyone else, which of course was my dad. I honestly, at the time, God had it out for me. I really believed that, and uh, I carried that into my adolescence, along with all of the uh, youthful insecurities and inadequacies that I felt at the time. I thought were very different and unique, but as I got older and you know talked with other people and got to know myself better, I found out these were just the kind of standard fare for all kids. You don't think you're strong enough, you're not big enough, you're not tough enough, you're not this or that enough. And to me, that event sealed it. It made it as though it was fact, and God was basically uh, confirming it. He was confirming to me that you are not worth it, that you are not, I don't care about you enough. In fact, I hate you enough to take the person away that you love the most. And so that was honestly, and I didn't realize that till I was much older, but that was honestly how I felt growing up.
And so you had a lot of things to work through, and so it was a process, and it was very difficult sometimes. And so some of the struggles that you face, um, just tell about that and how you were able to begin the stepping into like education and beginning to thrive in different ways, intellectually and in your writings and so forth. Give us a sense of the pathway there.
Sure. Well, the interesting thing was, we had been going to church every Sunday, and I always felt like it was something that we just had to do. I had no interest in Sunday school or any of the classes or anything like that. But it was something that we did do. It was an Episcopal church, which had already become very liberal, and the town we lived in was very liberal. Um, my parents were both Republicans, but they were New York, you know, New York Times Republicans, and uh, so. But after my father died and we had the funeral at that church, that was the last time I darkened the door of a church for decades. And as I grew into adolescence, that along with all the other insecurities made me very uncomfortable in my own skin. And when I discovered alcohol and drugs overnight, I just changed. I started working when I was 14, and I was a very hard worker. I was a very good worker. I got uh, advancement in wages very quickly. But when I discovered drugs and alcohol overnight, almost overnight, I became lazy. I got up late. I showed up at work late, and I became a different person. And they say when you become an alcoholic, which is what eventually happened to me. Well, actually, I think from my very first drink, I was an alcoholic. You cease to grow emotionally. Wherever you started, that's where you stay emotionally. I was 15 years old. And when I finally realized that that was my issue and I got sober in 19, at the age of 29, I was still emotionally 15 years old. And the interesting thing was I knew there was stuff wrong with me because I felt like, well, why should you have to drink or smoke pot or do any drugs to make yourself feel normal? Well, that hasn't always existed. What is the matter with me? And I went through a drug rehabilitation program. It was voluntary. I wasn't forced to go. Uh, I went to a psychiatrist. I went to a hypnotherapist. I tried transcendental meditation. I tried all these different things. And when all was said and done, a scotch on the rocks worked much better. So uh, I gave up on all that until finally it got so bad uh, that I had no choice. And I went to see a psychiatrist who most of your viewers might know is M. Scott Peck. He wrote a book called The Road Less Traveled, and his office was an hour away from my house. So I read his book and I thought this is the first time any of these supposed health self-help gurus have ever made any sense because he talked about taking personal responsibility, not blaming other people, growing up, essentially just, common sense stuff, right? And I said, oh, this makes sense. I'm going to go see him. So I went and talked to him for an hour and told him everything I was done. I didn't hold anything back. And at the end of it all, he said, well, you can keep coming to me for $100 an hour if you want, but the fact of the matter is, you're an alcoholic and your goal is to find God. And Um, I said, well, I've tried everything else. What kind of hypocrite would I be if I wasn't willing to try prayer? So I tried it, and shock of all shocks, it worked. And it was like a revolutionary transformation on my whole attitude towards everything that took place over a period of 3 days. And in my mind, it was as astonishing as seeing a flying saucer. It was that much of a spiritual experience, if you will. And so from that time forward, I made it a regular thing to pray. And in the morning, I would say, "Dear God, help me to have a good day today, for everybody's sake." and and I would have a good day for everybody's sake, because normally, as an active alcoholic, I was a really obnoxious person. I was not fun to be around in any, even sober. I was not fun to be around. And so, but things changed for me very fast. I had gone through 2 years of college, scraped by. Uh, I went right back to college. I took economics courses, graduated with a degree in economics in 1 year, and the chairman of the department was impressed, and he offered me a full scholarship plus stipend if I would go to their terminal master's program. So I went through their master's program, and I did very well. And then he hired me to teach for a short while. So I taught at the University of Delaware after graduating. And then I went on in my first career job, as it were. I mean, when I was drinking, I worked as a bartender, as a waiter, I was a landscaper, I was a house painter. I mean, any kind of odd job you can think of, I did them all. Uh, but nothing really of anything, any kind of substance. When I got my master's degree, the first job I had was with the Office of Management and Budget, which is the White House Budget Office. And I had been hired by the CIA to be an intelligence analyst in their Department of Economics. Um, but the clearance process took a year and a half. And, I just graduated from grad school. I was broke. I had no money. Uh, and so this job at the Office of Management and Budget came along, and I snapped it right up. And I really am grateful that I did, because I had read a lot of the stuff coming out of that department in the CIA, and frankly, without sounding too arrogant, I thought they were all a bunch of idiots. The stuff that they wrote was sophomoric, literally. And I got in arguments with the guy who would be my future boss on the phone numerous times because, you know, it was just, and I was very outspoken. I was not a shrinking violet at all. You know, once I went back to school and learned all this stuff, I became very, very strongly adamant about the field of economics and the conservatism that it necessarily leads you to if you honestly understand economics.
Jim, that's really quite a journey, and that takes you up to about what, 29, or then if you're as you're working in the government there, that probably took you into the 30s, and so my one of
Well, I was 35 when I started to work at OMB. Yeah, I was 29, and then I took a year off college to get sober, and then I was 30, and I had that. Uh, I graduated in 1983, so I was 31. Then I went to grad school for 2 years, so I was 33 when I got out of that. And then it was 2 years before I actually got a real. And then I taught for a year. So it wasn't till 1987 that I actually got a job. I was 35.
So you've had an incredibly challenging years actually getting up to that point, and then having highly regarded positions. And I'm wondering what was happening with you in terms of developing a worldview. On the one hand, you had some faith background, but not real solid. I think you yourself would mention that. But you clearly were conservative, and you just must have been mulling lots of things over in your head in terms of what you were seeing in our country and in our government. Right. So give us a little. 'Cause we're going to work into talking about your books and some of your influence in those ways.
Yeah, so what it was, you know, of course, I was fascinated with politics and history and all the things that were going on then, and there was a lot going on during the Reagan administration. You know, there was the Iran-Contra business. There was uh, the Robert Bork nomination. There were all these things, and you know, if you're a classically trained economist, you can't be anything but a conservative in terms of at least your fiscal outlook on things.
Why is that, Jim?
Um, well, because uh, free market capitalist economics, there's really only one kind of economics, and it's free market capitalism, and uh, everything else is a perversion of that. You know, economics is the study of how um, a society decides to distribute limited resources in the face of unlimited wants. Okay, and so you can, if you want to look at it that way, you take a communist country, and according to the theory anyway, a communist country takes the limited resources and then distributes it evenly to all of the members of that society. We know that nothing like that ever happens, but that's the theory, right? And in a capitalist society, um, uh, willing participants engage in mutually beneficial exchange of goods and services. So you hire me, and I willingly accept the job at the rate that we have agreed to do, or I provide a purchase, service, or a good that you decide that is worth your uh, money to pay for, so you purchase. Um, I always called I always called economics the science of survival because that's what it is. And the only kind of economics that prospers the society as a whole is free market capitalism. Communism does nothing of the sort. And the reason is, going back, it's the science of survival. If you give someone unlimited power to take resources, their uh, instinct for survival will become turbocharged, and they will take all of it, and they will keep it to themselves. Now, this, of course, is a secular society. This is not a society of people who believe in God, but a society of people who believe in God would never feel entitled to take other people's property and possessions. So the so what ultimately communism is, and it always devolves into this, no matter what the intentions are. Sometimes, you know, the intentions of communists uh, that have never actually experienced but are promoting it. A lot of people in our country think it's the greatest thing in the world and they're pushing for it. They don't realize that it inevitably always has to devolve into a kleptocracy where a few people at the top, who are the worst of the worst, uh, take all of the resources for themselves and then impose totalitarianism, totalitarian control on everyone else to secure that wealth that they have obtained uh, inappropriately. And so it always devolves into that. And the people that are willing to do that of necessity are literally psychopaths. only people that are that evil, that brutal, that monstrous can rise to the top in a society like that because there's no structure, there's no universally accepted ground rules. In our country, the universally accepted ground rules are supposed to be anyway, are the US Constitution and the Bill of Rights and the rule of law that came out of them, which clearly defines what we can and what we can't do. In a communist society, it's he who wins gets the most toys. And so it's always a battle, and it's a battle between the different communists. And ultimately, the very worst, the most brutal ones, the most backstabbing, the most mass murdering ones are the ones that rise to the top, and everybody else follows along or else. And that's inevitable simply because of uh, the survival instinct of people that goes wild when unconstrained. And so I realized that in 1987, I read Robert Conquest's um, The Great Terror, which was Stalin's mass terror when he killed 20 or 30, 40 million of his own people. Um,
Jim,
and I
interrupting you.
read that.
Jim, and so
Yeah.
you, that was 1987. And how many years had you already worked in the government at that point?
Well, that was while I had not gotten a job in until late September of '87, and in '86 I went on this 1 year solo investigation to find out what the attraction was of communism. Because here we had the Nicaraguan Contras and the Sandinistas battling it out. We had all of these battles in Central America, and all these people willing to die for this communism. I'm like, why on earth would anybody want to rule or be part of a communist country or help it? And so I wanted to find that out, and I spent a year researching it. And during this time, one of the last parts I was reading Robert Conquest's book, and it all hit me. I had an epiphany, and I didn't sleep for 3 days because I realized right at that time that that's what the communists were doing in our country. That's what the thing, all the stuff was happening in our country was was happening under the surface, underground, uh, by the communist movement. And the communist movement had, I already realized, penetrated major parts of the federal government and the Congress and the executive branch.
Jim, so as this was occurring, you apparently were getting fire in your belly. Maybe you didn't really understand it, but
It,
I'm just wondering what that looked like in terms of your career thinking or your thoughts. It's like you had. It sounds like you had righteous indignation, and we're trying to figure out
absolutely,
what to do with that. So, what did
absolutely.
that look like?
Well, I was very outspoken, and I was very outspoken at work. Um, and But there was very little I could do actually at work other than my job because it was a sensitive political position. I wasn't political; it was career, but it was directly under, the director of OMB, who was a political appointee under Reagan, and his name was Jim Miller. He was from Virginia. I got to actually know him personally, a really nice guy. And then the program directors for the different programs within the Office of Management and Budget underneath him. Uh, and They were all political. And so I couldn't really say anything publicly. I wanted to write what I had realized, and I mean, it would just come popping. I would sit at my desk and write articles and pound away furiously at my desk on my keyboard for an hour or two before somebody came in and said, "You got to do this, or you got to do that." And of course, it was stuff I set aside. I never published it because I couldn't. right? It would it could embarrass or cause problems for the administration, and I couldn't do that in that position. We were supposed to stay strictly nonpartisan, and but it was my way of getting my frustration out. And I actually wrote the outline of a book, and that book was published last summer in September. But the outline of this book was actually written in 1987 when I had my epiphany about what is going on in this country, because I knew even then that um, this was what was going on, that we were being slowly subverted from the inside by the international communist movement led by the Soviet Union and communist China.
So there you still were sitting in that seat, and it was still a number of years before you wrote this book, and we know you wrote other books. But so you had this desire inside of your body and your heart. You eventually got out of that position with the Office and Management, and was OMB stands for Office of Management and Budget, right? And so you left there. Did you were you able to land a position that allowed you to unfold that which you had recognized, or did that take a number of years, did you have to do basically freelance writing?
Yeah. Well, what happened was I was trying to express myself, and OMB would let you have a private business. You had to uh, get their okay. You had to tell them exactly what you were doing, and you had to get their okay, and you had to show what hours you would be working, and that it wouldn't interfere with your regular job at OMB. So I started a T-shirt business, and it was called Speak Out Now, Outfitters for the Politically Incorrect. And I made the very first politically incorrect T-shirt, and it just said politically incorrect along the front with the IN underneath in day glow orange. And and on the back it said free minds, free markets, free society. And people would come up to me in the street and they'd say, "Where do you get that shirt?" And I said, "Well, I make them." I said, "Well, where can I get one?" And I'd say, "Well, here, I have a bag. Put your money where your mouth is. $20. Here it is." And so I was making the shirts, and then I started to make companion coffee mugs with them. And I have to tell you, Dan Quayle has one of my shirts. Rush Limbaugh got a 3X size of one of those politically incorrect T-shirts. Newt Gingrich has a shirt. Even Pat Buchanan has one of those shirts. So I had a whole list of people, famous people, and it made money for a little while. But even with the coffee mug, hats, and everything else, and all the ancillary stuff, I kind of ran out of slogans pretty quick. And so I came up with this idea to create a very unusual, decorative gift coffee mug using uh, uh, color, heat reacting, color sensitive, color changing inks. And and so that developed into a company called Wonder Mugs, which you can still get on Amazon. There's still a wondermugs.com website. I don't have anything to do with it. But there was the first one we did was a Christmas tree. When you pour in a hot drink, the lights on the tree light up. And it was a huge hit, and by the end of 1994, when I first came up with the first two designs, it was in 500 stores around the country, and then in Belk Store Services, and in Strawbridge and Clothier, which is no longer a department store, but that was a big one then, Philadelphia based. And so I really got into the idea of being an entrepreneur. I still had that fire in my belly, and I was still doing research on my free time, but I wanted to try my hand at being an entrepreneur, and I figured I may have a few years to do that before the communist takeover. So I figured I'd try to get wealthy first, and it was modestly successful. But after 9/11, I felt like I could not restrain myself any longer. I felt like I really had to say what I already had known, what I had learned, what I had researched. So I began writing, and I very quickly got a following. But of course, all my writing, if you recall back then, that's was the start of the blogosphere. And I had a blog called Truth and Consequences. You can still find it. Um, and I wrote dozens of articles for that. I wrote for David Hackworth's.
And Jim, just to interrupt you for a moment here. So were you still working in the government?
No, no, I'm sorry. What happened was in 1993, first of all, Clinton came in. I didn't really want to be doing what Clinton wanted me to do. But even if I did, my t-shirt and mug business was taking off so fast. I was spending more time with that than I was at work. And I figured, well, maybe I ought to just let it go. And so I left that and struck out as an entrepreneur. So I left the government in 1993, and I didn't look back.
So you were living off from your sales then of your entrepreneurial
Living off the sales, actually, I had built up such a good credit rating as a bureaucrat, you know, paying all my credit cards on time. I had tens of thousands of dollars in, credit line that I hadn't used. The credit card companies became my unwitting venture capitalists. I borrowed a lot of money on credit, and I paid myself that way. I paid my rent that way. I mean, yeah. So it got kind of crazy. I went into debt, and I didn't become profitable for 5 years. So it was difficult. There were a lot of sleepless nights, and a lot of ways to discover how to handle stress, shall we say, without resorting to my old standby, which was alcohol.
hmm So Jim, then you began to you were with you began to do write some articles then, or you were is how what were you doing for your making money then? Was that what you were relying on?
I was still doing the mug business. I was still doing the mug business. I met my future wife in 1996 when I was doing the mug business, and we got married in 1998, and we had our first daughter. And then at this point, I was 46 and she was 41, and we wanted to have more kids, but we couldn't because she was frankly too old. And so we adopted um, we adopted a child from Guatemala, and so we had two children, and that was in 2001. And I kept my business until 2005. But my wife worked as an attorney. She had a very high-paying job, and she urged me to stop working and just stay home with the kids. And the the mug business, took a turn for the worse through no fault of my own, but they moved the facility down to Texas, and the people running the Texas facility really, really botched it up. Uh, they changed the whole way of producing the product, and the quality declined significantly. And I couldn't get them to change, and I tried. I called them. I couldn't even reach them on the phone. So I finally told the owner of the company. I said, "Look, I'm not going to do this anymore. You guys can have it." And I walked away from it. And I just began writing when I wasn't taking care of the kids. As a stay-at-home dad, I was doing a lot of writing, but it was once again all for free. And then I began writing for American Thinker. And in 2008, I learned about the Cloward Piven strategy and wrote an article called Barack Obama and the Strategy of Manufactured Crisis, which went more viral than probably any other article up until that point at any event. It was millions and millions of people read that and reposted it. My name was on the first 3 pages of Google. Uh, Glenn Beck contacted me, or his producer contacted me. They wanted more information. I wrote a series of articles on it. And of course, I didn't even claim credit for it because um, it was actually David Horowitz, who recently died, unfortunately. Uh, he had written about the Cloward Piven strategy on his website called Discover the Networks, which is a really good resource if you want to research anything about the left. Go to Discover the Networks and just type in a name or a organization name, and it'll pop up, and all kinds of things show up. And I just stumbled upon that one day, and for him, it was just another typical leftist strategy. Wasn't a big deal for him. He just had it out there, and they'd probably been out there for a couple of years, but nobody paid attention to it. But to me, it was an epiphany. So I wrote an
And
article about it.
in short, because that is a huge issue or matter, explain that as succinctly as you can.
Sure, Richard Cloward and Frances Fox Piven were a married couple of sociology professors working at Columbia University while Obama was going there, by the way. And they came up with this article in 1966 called The Way to the Poor, How to End Poverty, or a method to end poverty. And their idea was to utilize the welfare system to overwhelm the government with demands for public services to the point where the government would collapse. And after the government collapsed, they could then propose their solution, which of course would be socialism. And they were both Trotskyite communists. They called themselves democratic socialists, but there's no such thing. They helped found the Democratic Socialists of America, which is the largest communist organization in the country, bigger than the Communist Party USA, but it hides under that democratic socialist mantra, which is totally false. But anyway, Richard Cloward um, was the inspiration for President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society program, which was the vast expansion of welfare. Richard Cloward was the inspiration for that. And that was a vast expansion of welfare. Now, um, Johnson's primary motive was that he knew that if you start out handing welfare willy-nilly to minorities, they're all going to gravitate towards the Democratic Party, which is exactly what happened. He wanted to create a captive vote, and that's exactly what they did with the blacks and with most minorities. Uh, the Republican registration of blacks, which before, it started under FDR, and when he created his New Deal, a lot of blacks moved into the Democratic Party because they started with AFDC and Medicare. And so they gravitated towards these federal programs, unconstitutional, by the way. Those are programs that are supposed to be reserved to the states. And in fact, people complain, well, if there wasn't federal welfare, there wouldn't be any way to help people. Well, that's not true at all. Before FDR, states and churches and other nonprofits had provided welfare to people that needed it. But it was better that way because it was limited. And so people knew that they could get help if they needed it, but they would eventually have to find a job. But under the welfare system, hey, have whatever you want, stay unemployed as long as you want. And of course, that created an entirely toxic inner city system, which the Democrats have thrived on by giving them more and more excuses to create more and more government programs that put more and more weight on the government. And Cloward and Pivens,
Or the so-called genius behind that. And then, and so it, when so you, as you have mentioned, this influenced Glenn Beck. So what did he do once you awakened him to that reality?
well, Cloward and Piven had said the answer was a guaranteed annual income. And at that time, it was uh, what would be in today's dollars between $40,000 and $80,000 per family of four. And this whether you work or not. Now, this is their solution to the problem of too much welfare. Think about that. If you have too much welfare, is there going to be less government spending if everybody's getting between $40,000 and $80,000 a year, whether they work or not? Or is it going to be even more expensive? Well, of course, it's going to be more expensive because the real goal is to collapse everything to create chaos. And then in that chaos, they come in and take over, and it becomes a totalitarian government under their control. So the whole goal was ultimately communist control of the US government. And so I wrote a number of articles on the Cloward Piven strategy, and American Thinker became very well known as a big part of that, although it had already been quoted in the Wall Street Journal and quoted by Rush Limbaugh and others. Mark Levin used to read my articles on air. And that was back in 2009 when all this came out. Glenn Beck's producer contacted me and they wanted my materials. I gave them my materials gladly. And they had been interviewing people, and I thought they were going to interview me. They ultimately decided not to, but they used my materials as to create a whole series of shows and then did some more of their own research to even beef it up further. Um, to create a whole series of shows on the Cloward Piven strategy.
So Jim, how long did you ride that? How long was that a major aspect of your influence? Not to say that it still isn't from your hand in a very real way, but how long was the vitality in that?
Yeah, well, we that was around 2008, 2009, and my family got caught up in the whole financial crisis, the collapse, the housing collapse at that time, and we well, I had to quit everything and just and go back to work. And I mean, uh, I started catering and bartending again. I started doing whatever kind of work I could find just so that we could stay in our house and pay the bills. And so I basically had to give up my writing right at the point where if I had continued, I probably would have gotten well known enough to be hired somewhere and turn that into a living. But as it stood, I had to just drop it all and get just find what work I could find. And the federal government didn't want to hire me anymore. I'm in my late 50s at this point, and we're in my 50s anyway. And they didn't want an old retread. They wanted young kids. I applied a couple of times, but never got anywhere. Never even got a response.
Where I became familiar with you was through Frank Gaffney and the Center for Security Policy. And so, how did you connect with him, and what was that working arrangement? And because I know that was quite long term itself.
Well, it was interesting. I mean, I got to know a lot of people through my writing and just through friends. And I wound up doing some fundraising work for David Horowitz for his company. Uh, and I did some fundraising for others. I did some for the Heritage Foundation. And they were all interconnected at that time. And Center for Security Policy needed some editing work. They hired me to edit a book. And then they hired me for some other ancillary projects just as a contractor. And when the refugee resettlement issue became prominent through the work of Ann Corcoran, uh, and she wrote a book for the Center for Security Policy called The Hijra, uh, uh, Refugee Resettlement and the Hijra to America. I think that was the title of it. That became a bestseller, and Gaffney wanted her to write some more stuff, and she didn't want to, but she suggested my name, and he already knew me, and so he asked me to write a brief on refugee resettlement. And the way I write is I research and research, and then when I'm done, I'm right. Right, I write, and I just write, and then when I'm done, I stop. Well, he wanted a 2,000 word essay that he could put up on his website, could be downloaded as a PDF. By the time I got done, I had a 25,000 page document. And I said, well, Frank, I'm sorry, it's a little bit longer than you wanted. Um, but you can do whatever you want with this, edit it, and
And Jim, that also was a very that was a very significant piece as well. And Ann Corcoran she was an all-star, and explain that because that was huge. It still is huge.
yeah, Ann Corcoran had a blog called the Refugee Resettlement Watch, and she would put out articles almost every day. She had gone to a county meeting, county council meeting, because she had noticed a lot of refugees, Middle
Was she in
Eastern.
Pennsylvania or New Hampshire or
No, she's
where was
in Western Maryland. Western Maryland. Yeah, and she went to Hagerstown County Council meeting and asked why all of these people were being resettled in her community. She had no idea who they were, but they weren't Americans. They didn't speak English. And that launched her research into the refugee resettlement program. And she was astonished, as we all were, as to the extent of this program. And uh, she wrote a book for the Center for Security Policy, um, Refugee Resettlement in the Hijra to America.
explain Hijra or define Hijra.
Hijra is the Islamic notion of immigration as a form of invasion, immigration as a means to take over the target country. In other words, they don't immigrate here just to come to a different country and enjoy the benefits of that country. They target that country to take it over to become a Muslim nation.
Like they've done in London and England and elsewhere.
Yes, yes, exactly, and France.
And then she also, with your help, she was also shedding light upon places like Bethany Christian Services and different religious organizations that also were receiving all kinds of money and were helping to relocate these people with no conviction against it.
Right. Well, she talked about that some, and frankly, that was the basis, the big part of the basis for this first book of mine, where I discuss the nonprofit agencies, they call them voluntary agencies, and the the amount of money they were taking every year from the federal government to resettle refugees, and they were out of the state, they were financed by the State Department. Um, Office of Refugees, Population and Migration. And they were also funded by the Office of Refugee Resettlement and Health and Human Services Bureau. And that office was responsible for resettling illegal alien migrant minors. In other words, if you came here as a minor, you would be picked up by a voluntary agency being paid by the Office of Refugee Resettlement. They would put you up in a hotel or some other place, and then they'd have you resettle, supposedly handed over to your American relatives. But as we now know, many of those children are being handed off to traffickers. And two of the biggest illegal alien children uh, refugee resettlement groups, or resettlement groups, they're not refugees, at least not by the legal definition, um, are Catholic Charities and the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. And between them, the U.S. Conference, I wrote this book in 2015. In 2019, I wrote a follow-on book, which went into even greater detail. It was a very extensive book with tons of charts and tables uh, that you can't find anywhere else because I compiled them. For example, I compiled a list of the number of uh, languages spoken in public schools by going to school districts throughout the United States and finding out from their very own statistics. So I have a table in here that compiles about 20 of the top school districts. In one of them, 130 languages are spoken in public school. I mean, how do you conduct public school that way? So this gives you the idea. The subtitle of this first book was Refugee Resettlement, Refugees or Red Green Axis, Refugees, Immigration, and the Agenda to Erase America, which is basically what the idea is. You bring in people from all over the world of different cultures, uh, different languages, and the more people you bring in, the more that dilutes the uniqueness of American society and culture. And we just become, one among many in a big crowd of people who uh, just happen to live here, many of whom, many as the Democrats can manage, will get every kind of welfare benefit they can for life, and that is until the Democrats establish an unimpeachable one-party majority, and then we will discover for ourselves just how bad communist totalitarianism is, because at its heart, that's what the movement is.
And Jim, you are actually the one that coined that term, the red green axis.
Well, that was the title of the book, and it was also the title of the second book. But honestly, I had a different title, and I can't remember what it was. Something similar, but it was Frank Gaffney who actually coined that phrase. I have to give him uh, you know, give him credit for that. Um, but this was the second book. It was published in 2019, while we had a huge number of illegals coming across, but nothing like what happened afterwards. But I predicted that if Joe Biden was elected, it would be what it became, because what happened in 2015 in Europe with the mass migration that was triggered by the Syrian war, but resulted in people coming from every country throughout Central, throughout South, throughout Africa, and throughout the Middle East as far as Afghanistan. Um, that was a um, that was a warm up. That was a practice for what was going to happen here.
Jim, you've really been quite a prophetic voice when when you just consider these things that we've been talking about here. That you're like a prophet without honor in his own hometown in many ways in America. You fight the fight. Yes, and also you certainly are a researcher. That is a you're a bulldog in your research. I mean, you stick to it and you nail it and you go after it and you're relentless in what you come up with. Um, and I know you get sometimes you have seasons where you do a fair amount of speaking. I know you like to speak, but it's you can't make a living on that, unfortunately. I mean, it helps though, right? It certainly helps.
Oh yeah. Oh no, it
Yes,
definitely
I know
helps.
you.
If I were a liberal talking about how bad President Trump was and how great it was to have people from 180 different countries coming here to get welfare benefits for free without any kind of vetting whatsoever, oh, I'd be making tens of thousands of dollars per speech, and I'd have a full full schedule throughout the year. But unfortunately, no, we don't get to do that.
A few years ago, Jim, I also know that you were in Michigan and you were over in Oakland County and spoke with one of the leaders there, the Oakland County Executive, Brooks Patterson. Talk about that for a few minutes, if you would.
Well, that was in uh, late 2015 or early 20, I think it was 2016 actually. And it was right after I had published this book. And the thing was, he had been the chief executive for that county for, I think, 20 years or more at that point. I know it was at least 20 years. And every year his books were in the black. I mean, he ran that county like a machine. It was an example for the rest of the state and frankly for the nation as to how to run a county, a government. And and he was beloved. He really was beloved. And he had no problem getting reelected. Well, a couple of friends of mine who lived there at the time, they both moved out since, but they arranged, excuse me, a meeting with Brooks and myself and these two other guys. And I did a short PowerPoint presentation for Brooks based on this book. And I included in it the estimates of the number of refugees that had been resettled in Oakland County without his knowledge or consent. And there were thousands. And they were Middle Eastern, a lot of Syrians. And, it's not to say that all these people are bad people, but you resettle people from the Middle East, and you're virtually guaranteed that among them will be terrorists who have been implanted in that refugee flow for the specific purpose of either being sleeper agents or at some point targeting Americans for attack. And of course, that's what's happened since all over the country. And so he was shocked. He was absolutely bowled over by that. And he and I became very good friends after that. We went out to dinner a few times, and he had me come speak to the Business Roundtable, the Michigan Business Roundtable. And it originally was being underwritten by, I forget, one of the big Detroit banks, and about 200 people there. And I was going to describe to them what was going on in their counties because the governor, and he was a Republican at the time, the governor was supposed to, or the lieutenant governor or the secretary, no, I think it was maybe the secretary of state, was supposed to advise and obtain consent from the county executives um, regarding whether or not they could have refugees, X number of refugees resettled into their county. They were never asked. They were never told. They didn't even know that the program existed. So these people were absolutely shocked. But when the Detroit News or the Detroit Free Press, I forget which one it was, heard about it, they said, "Oh, this Islamophobes coming to speak to the Business Roundtable," and they, of course, smeared me and never gave me the opportunity to respond. In an editorial, an op-ed, they said, "No, we're not going to let you respond." Period. And and so one of the big banks dropped its sponsorship of this event. Well, the event was held anyway, but it was discredited a lot by those actions. And the same thing happened a couple of years later when I was going to speak at a church, a big church in Oakland
West,
County, I
West,
believe.
West,
Was
West
Oakland County?
Bloomfield, West Bloomfield Baptist.
Yeah,
I was
West
going to bring
Bloomfield
that up, so
Baptist
I'm
Church.
glad you picked that up. Yeah, do talk about that.
Yeah,
Big deal.
yeah. It was myself and Sharam Hadian, who was a converted Iranian Muslim Christian convert, who is a very powerful. Yeah, he's a great guy. He's a pastor at a church in Washington State. He's just a wonderful guy, and he and I were scheduled to speak there. Um, but there was a school, an elementary school on the church grounds that was being rented by the school. It wasn't owned by the church, and they came to the church elders and demanded that they cancel that event after the Detroit News came out saying that two Islamophobes were going to speak. And these people were literally terrified for the safety of their children. And you couldn't exactly blame them because they were getting death threats. They were getting death threats because we were going to speak there. And so this is the kind of thing that happens when you import these kinds of people. And this is exactly why I wrote those two books. And it's why it's so important to understand, you know.
And Jim,
And, the Muslim.
in continuing with that, I'm trying to think of the name of the pastor. I've talked with him since and interviewed him a couple of years ago about this. A good man, a good staunch man at that church, and so I think you got on the phone and reinforced those elders, and then they were turned around and they said yes, they were willing to do it, and the pastor was very supportive of you speaking, and then they came again with another barrage, and I think that's when they got to the school itself, and then they finally did shut
Oh, yeah.
down, and that was very
Yeah.
that's very troubling because to be able to educate and inform about this threat in the Dearborn area and the Detroit area was so significant, and that pastor was bold. He's a good man. He is still serving in that church, by the way. But it was
Yeah. No, I spoke with him and I spoke with all the elders and I convinced them to let it go forward. And then when the people from the school heard about it again, they went back to him the last time and basically begged them. And or they said, if you allow this, we'll pull out. I think that was finally what they finally resorted to. And they had received threats. Now, the Muslim community in Michigan is, for the most part, you know, been fine. They were brought here by Henry Ford, who is kind of a bigot. He thought they would be better workers in his factories than the blacks would be. So he first imported them over here. And as you know, the mayor of Hamtramck, a Muslim mayor of Hamtramck, supported Donald Trump for president. You know, um, and my personal view is that most Muslims are kind of like a lot of Christians. They might go to their mosque every Sunday or wherever the heck they go to, but whenever they go to it, and they might go through the motions. A lot of Christians the same way. But when it comes right down to it, they'd rather just live their lives and go to work, and not have to worry about it. Uh, The only difference is if their imams tell them this is something they've got to do, in that culture, it's something that they really have to do. And so, uh, you know, you've heard plenty of stories about in Turkey where Muslim and Christian people lived side by side and they were best of friends until the Turkish leader said, kill the Christians. And then they went over next door and apologized and said, I'm sorry, but boom, you're dead.
Well, Jim,
So,
as we move towards closing, a couple of things that I just want to be able to also highlight rather quickly. A couple of your
yes,
other
sir.
books that you've written, I just would at least just I'd like to have you. Um, I'm going to give you the titles, and then you just give a couple of them you already have. The Red Green Axis. Um, you haven't said anything about one of your most popular books. Who was Karl Marx? The Men, the Motives, and the Menace Behind Today's Rampaging Left. I think that was a bestseller, wasn't it?
It was an Amazon bestseller. Yes, it was. Well, it made it into the top 100 at Amazon, in all books at Amazon for over a week and was down to number 35 at one point. Glenn Beck said it should be in every household in America. Unfortunately, that isn't true, but it it it, it was a very popular book, and it basically describes, you know, who was Karl Marx, the men, the motives, and the menace behind today's rampaging American left, and it described, I wrote it it was published in May of 2021, right after we had the year of riots of George Floyd, and I explained where all that stuff comes from. I explained where everything that we were seeing, even at that time, was absolutely over the edge crazy. Um, I explained who came up with the various strategies to bring this toxic environment into our country and then turbocharge it. And that's all very well and succinctly described in the Who is Karl Marx book. And then in Manufacturing Crisis, I go much deeper into all of it and talk about everything that's happened since. Uh, we're talking about global warming, you're talking about genderism, you're talking about welfare, you're talking about inner city crime, all of these things. And
And
then
it's
go
and it's
broad
really
and
it's
on and on.
it's not a huge volume either. I mean, it's very readable. It's very understandable, and it's well documented, as all your books are. Another book, though, your most recent book, um, and and this was very recently. You were on the Mark Levin show. I've got my copy
Yep,
here too. You're on the
yep.
Mark Levin show, and I listened when I knew you were going to go on. I made sure to listen, and he sang your praises.
Well, I mean, manufactured crisis is essentially the modus operandi of the radical left, which everybody has to understand. There's not a domestic left, at least radical left. They live here, but they are under the guidance and influence of the international communist movement, which to this day is run by Russia and China. China has taken on a prominence in recent years because it's been very effective at penetrating our society at all levels, uh, stealing our intellectual property, uh, you know, sending thousands of their kids to American universities for the specific purpose of learning the latest technology and then taking it back to communist China so they can apply it to their military hardware and tactics and things and know what we're doing at the same time. In my Red Green Axis book, uh, I mentioned that every year we allow 70,000 legal migrants from communist China every year. The only larger group we allow in legally is from Mexico. And so we are allowing 70,000 Chinese communist agents every year. And whether they want to be or not, they are all working for the CCP. And the reason is because their family is back home and their families are essentially hostages. If they don't do whatever the CCP wants them to do, their family back home could wind up in jail or worse. They could wind up in some place and get their organs harvested, which the CCP is already doing with the Uyghurs and the Falun Gong people who still live there. It's gruesome what they do. And our corporations have essentially conspired with the CCP just so that they could get cheap labor. And it's really something. I mean, the CCP needs to be literally um, marginalized and starved out of existence. And we could do that because they rely entirely on us for their markets. You'll say, oh no, they have India and all these other countries. Well, guess what? India and all those other countries rely on us for their markets. So whether it's directly or indirectly, CCP relies on us. Same thing can be said for Russia. Russia, since the supposed fall of the Soviet Union, Russia has sort of fallen into the back of everybody's mind, except for now with the Ukraine war, where Vladimir Putin is trying to reestablish the old Soviet Union. Well, the old Soviet Union never really left. He's Vladimir Putin is a KGB agent, a hardcore communist, always has been, always will be, and the Soviets still lead the Chinese in um, nuclear missile technology and quantities of nuclear weapons. And so we tend to forget that. Um, and we don't know, honestly, the kind of progress that they've made in different kinds of offensive and defensive weapons because we've taken our eyes off the ball. We're now focused on Red China. But I guarantee you, so the Russians, the Soviet Union, have continued to build, improve, and deploy newer and newer ICBMs, as well as countermeasures, uh, satellite killers, and all kinds of other things that we don't even begin to know anything about. And we ceased caring after the supposed fall of the Soviet Union, which was really a complete sham. It was designed for us to lower our guards.
Well, you can see why Glenn Beck and Charlie Kirk and Mark Levin have turned to you because you are a deep and significant investigative researcher and reporter. And
It's very important for people to get this because it explains the depth of the fight that the depth of the fight that we're battling and the many fronts that we're battling it on. But it also provides the largest chapter is what is to be done. What are the conclusions? What can we do? And it's a very long list. It's not really a new list. We've been doing a lot of this stuff for years, but we really have to focus on this stuff now. And I very explicitly talk about the different things. Number one thing we have to do is pray. We have to pray for our country. We have to pray for God's salvation. We have to pray for God's forgiveness, and we have to pray for God's help. Because if God is with us, who can be against us? But it's not a certain thing that God is with us because we really we have fallen so far away as a country that, we make Sodom and Gomorrah look like a pleasant country cottage, I mean, really, the way how derelict we've become. So we really need to ask for God's forgiveness. But there are so many things we need to do. We need to strengthen, and this is probably the most important single thing that we should be doing at the state level and the federal level with all government officials. And we need to get stronger politicians hired, elected to do this. We need to strengthen our subversion laws because that is how they are playing this game. They subvert organizations. And we have laws against subversion, but we don't enforce them. We need to strengthen them and then enforce them. People who engage in this are committing treason. They should go to jail or face capital punishment for what is essentially an attempt to murder an entire society.
Yeah, well said, Jim. And what would be the best way of ordering your book and then give your contact information too?
Sure, sure. The easiest way is to just go to crisisnow.net, crisisnow.net. That's my website. And if you click on the picture of the book on that page, you just click on this picture, it'll send you right to Amazon where you can order the book. It's also on some of the independent sites. It's on Barnes and Noble, although it's not in the bookstores. It's on their website. It's on Abe Books and some of those other independent ones, Books A Million. Um, if you want to get a signed copy from me, send a request to my Gmail address, simpson.truth@gmail.com, simpson.truth@gmail.com. And I have to charge a little extra because I have to pack it and ship it after it's already been packed and shipped to me. So I'm paying shipping twice. So it's $20 at Amazon. I charge $30 for a signed copy if you want to get one from me, um, and and you can send me a check or you can do a credit card over the phone or something like that. But anyway, simpson.truth@gmail.com for a signed copy.
Fantastic. Jim, you're a great blessing to me personally, and I'm thankful you've given us this much time.